Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. And this week, we are discussing...
Well, I came over to you excitedly because I nerdily learnt something I didn't know. Is that fair enough to say?
I think that's very fair.
I should probably explain what it is. And as many of you know, both myself and Gareth are keen, almost nerdy military historians in terms of we like military history and the lessons it learns. And for many of you will say that has no interest for me because I'm not in the military. But as you know, we've obviously connected these with non-military topics. And today, as I was led down the rabbit hole that is Wikipedia, I came across a mission, an operation, which I'd never heard of before. And given that I spend quite a lot of my time looking at military history and reading books, you get particularly excited when you find something that you've never heard of before. So I'll tell the story, but very quickly, you'll know that this is actually a slightly different topic, which honestly, through the years, I've bumped into. And that, well, I'll preempt this, which is the story is, when should you do something and when should you not do something? Because we spend all our lives talking about how to do something. We solve problems because we're problem solvers, leaders, leading people. Sometimes it's important not to do things. And here's the story. So any military historians, this one's a little bit for you, but we'll get onto the stuff as well. So Gareth, have you ever heard of Operation Jupiter?
No, I don't think I have.
It's great. There's so many of these military missions that you go look. And actually, the next time I'm at the National Archives, I'm going to have to go look at this because there's another one where there'll be a big, thick planning. Anyway, Operation Jupiter was a planned British assault on Norway in 1942. And for those of you who are not World War II aficionados, 1940, obviously, the Germans invaded France and invaded Norway. And of course, there was Dunkirk evacuation, etc., etc. So in 1942, it was not a particularly strong time for the British military. And so one option, which obviously, and we'll talk about why they were doing that, was to invade Norway. And this was in 1942. It was designed to achieve a couple of things. The first one was to open a second front in Europe to relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, which there was huge pressure from Stalin to the Western allies saying, we are dying while you are not. What are you going to do to support us? It was also aimed at disrupting German access to Norway's resources, not just iron ore, which was huge, and that came from Sweden through Norway. But of course, there was also heavy water and various other things. So there was fantastic strategic reason. And last but not least, if you are in Norway, you have already crossed a large body of water to get to Europe. So it would put you in a great position. So honestly, this, if you look at it, the strategic goals were very clear. They were urgent and they were worthwhile. In other words, if you could do these things, this would be fantastic.
And there were, of course, a series of raids into Norway for a lot of the same reasons, but those were raids
as opposed to an invasion.
Not invasion.
Spoiler alert, they didn't do it.
Hence why we hadn't heard of it.
Exactly. I mean, I love that there are still these operations. You think someone spent all this time imagining it and it didn't happen. Things, and this isn't supposed to be the boring bit. This is going to lead us on to the next bit, is why didn't they do it? So we've just said that strategically, this was a highly valuable exercise. This would have had a very important outcome, which later they did in terms of invasion of France, D-Day, which we know about, Italy and various other things. So first thing was the Allies did not have naval and air superiority. So we had a very strong fleet. We had an air force that was growing, but we didn't have the resources to sustain an invasion force, which is very, very different.
Yeah.
This isn't just can we prevent, can we defend? This isn't can we sort of raid? This is can we create a significant force that would actually allow us to have air and naval superiority? I can't, I'm going to get this wrong. I think at D-Day, there were 8,000 ships at D-Day to support the operations. We did not have those ships.
Yeah.
And the German forces in Norway were very well entrenched. There were strong Luftwaffe contingents because they were also attacking the UK. So the first one was they didn't have naval and air superiority. The second one was there were logistical challenges. Norway, I don't know whether you know this. I don't know if you've been to Norway. Yeah, he's smiling. He has been to Norway. I was just watching, who's the chap who races bikes? And
Guy Martin.
Guy Martin.
Yeah.
There's a TV series, which is excellent, by the way, if anyone hasn't caught it, it's on Channel 4, where he's learning to be a Royal Marine Commando, Northern Flank in Norway. So anyway, Norway, how hard is it to go to Norway, fight in Norway, and be resupplied in Norway, Gareth?
It is relatively difficult, particularly in the winter.
Can I just say, only a Royal Marine would say relatively difficult. As a civilian, I'm going to go with it's blooming difficult, and particularly in winter.
So one of the important features of Norway is the access to the North Atlantic, and particularly for the Axis forces in the Second World War, access and control of the ports in Norway was particularly important. Norway is an Arctic country, and in the winter it's bloody cold. And it's very difficult terrain. So, for anyone who's ever looked at Norway on a map, you will see that there's an awful lot of small island groups. There are the fjords, sort of inlets of water. It's a very difficult coastline, but the rest of the country is also quite mountainous. And of course, in winter, deep snow. In summer, the frost thaws and you end up with bogs, so moving armor around would be extremely difficult. And what you end up with is sort of terrain that is particularly difficult just to survive in, let alone fight in. And that's why it's one of the reasons that the Royal Marines are the mountain and Arctic warfare specialists of the UK forces, is that you need a particular type of training and skills to fight there. So I suspect one of the challenges straight away is actually you can't just throw a load of conscripted soldiers who've done a bit of basic training. You're going to need a relatively specialised force that can be sustained with all of the equipment and enabling capabilities to keep them alive.
Well, I'll go one step further. It's not just specialist troops, it is troops. 1942, we're in the Middle East, we're in North Africa, and actually they're winding up for invasion of Europe.
Yeah.
And so, but, and this is the point, this is maybe the whole
which
point.
At this point is not Normandy, it's the southern invasion of soft underbelly.
I mean, actually,
Italy.
even in 42, they are talking about invasion of northern France. It takes a lot longer. But before we go any further on this, I just want to make the point, Gareth, that I'm rather disappointed. You are a Royal Marine. You are someone who solves problems. And you have just said, well, of course, this is very, very hard. That's not what we're looking for,
Not
Gareth.
good enough.
We're looking for solutions, because let me go back to the strategic goals. Are you telling me, Gareth, these strategic goals are not critical? He's looking at me.
I'm not saying that.
Exactly. Well, we'll come back to that. Anyway, back to Jupiter.
But I think that is the crux of the discussion.
That is the crux.
Which is, we've talked a lot on this podcast in the past about being creative about challenges, problem solving, not just doing things the old way that you've always done them, finding new ways of doing things. I think what we need to get on to talking about in this podcast is, when is it just too much? How do you make the decision to... We talked last week and the week before about Churchill, or a few weeks ago, about Churchill, and we talked about his just keep buggering on quote, just keep chipping away at the problem. And of course, in a lot of circumstances, tenacity and just keep going is a really useful tactic. that flies in the face of what we're talking about today, which
Exactly,
is
exactly.
when do you know when the right decision is not to pursue something?
Particularly when everything around you says you should carry on and do it, almost even if it's the wrong answer. Anyway, in the end, again, I think we've already said this, Jupiter was deemed infeasible as a plan and it was abandoned. Here were the things they thought about. And so this is, I'm learning about this, so I'll probably get this a bit wrong. The first thing was the importance of prioritization of resources. The Allies really understood the need to focus on theatres with a higher probability of success and greater strategic value. So, yes, this would be valuable, but if we balance it across all the things we could do with those resources, it turns out much better. The second thing, and this is what really triggered this episode for me, is the phrase "creative ideas have limits," and I
Yeah.
love that. And it is, while planners explored various ways to stretch available resources, they ultimately concluded that no amount of ingenuity could overcome the fundamental challenges of geography, weather, and the enemy strength. And they actually thought about what are other things we could do to achieve this. So you're absolutely right. Look, Jupiter as an operation was really to bring us onto this topic. First of all, it was fascinating that you don't hear about the operations that didn't go ahead. And by the way, I was reading about this the other day. In the Far East, as the Americans were taking the island chains, there is an attack on an island called, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Tarawa, I think it's called, which was a US Marine attack. And in the end, 2,000 US Marines died. And it's considered an example where the people organizing the attack and the leaders who were leading the attack underestimated the enemy, underestimated the complexity of the problem, and lots of Marines died. And arguably, and of course, it's always easy to second guess, they could have done it a different way or not done it at all and achieved the same result. So there's almost the balance of you can go ahead and do it and it can go right. And everyone sing songs about you because it was ever so brave and you were ever so ingenious. You can do it and fail miserably. Or this last one, which I think is the one we don't talk about enough, which is what if you say no? And I'm really fascinated by this because, and I joked about this, and saying, come on, Gareth, Royal Marines, have this can-do attitude. It really is important to have a can-do attitude. It really is important to tackle what many would consider are unsolvable problems. But it's almost taboo to say, this one's an unsolvable problem, we're not going to do it. Now, in this particular case, I think one element of why you could say no was because actually the Allies had lots of options. It wasn't, this is our only option. We just have to keep going and keep going. Even though the strategic goals were very, very clear, they actually had the luxury of saying, well, we've got this plan for the invasion of Europe in a few years. It'll be hard because the Russians will be very disappointed with us and we won't have that strategic launch point to attack Germany. But you know what? Maybe this isn't the right operation. I think there are lots of other situations where organizations can get them into a place where they don't have those options. And so not only is my question, sorry, this was a really big run up to this episode, how do you decide whether a problem is truly solvable or unsolvable? And the second one that makes me really nervous is what do you do if it's an unsolvable problem and there is no other alternative? And I think in terms of business, if you're a business and you need to, competition has launched a new product and you literally don't have the ability to launch a competing product, what do you do? I also wanted to throw in this idea of optimism.
Yeah.
I also wanted to throw in this idea of what are the effects on the teams in the middle of these conversations, because I'm betting with Operation Jupiter, someone said to the planners, you don't understand how important this is. I spoke to Churchill this morning, and if we don't come up with a plan, the second front may never be opened or whatever. So there's all these things mixing around. We're always focused on how do we do something. And part of the assumption is there is an answer.
Yeah.
What do you do if there isn't an answer? And how do you know that you're not giving up too soon versus now is the right time to give up, or not necessarily give up, but change the rules of the game?
So I think there's a couple of things here. One is, and you've already mentioned it, we we're looking back in history and have the both advantage, but also to an extent when discussing strategy, disadvantage of knowing how everything unfolds and what worked and how the Allies eventually succeeded. What we don't know is what other branch plans or routes there would have been to success. And of course, there would have been, things could have been done differently. If you put yourself in the position of the Allied planners, whether that's geopolitical strategic planners, Churchill, Eisenhower, Stalin, et al., or it's military planners looking at resources, actually they don't know what's going to work, what isn't going to work. They're balancing risk. They're balancing the resources they have available. And of course, with that, it's can we wait longer and get more resources, or should we act now? And of course, the enemy's trying to do the same thing. With geography, where is the best place to open up new fronts to stretch the Axis forces? With politics, is the risk of Norway, where it's going to be more difficult, worth it because it's going to be in the interest of the Soviets and all of the geopolitical factors that that creates? Or is it going to piss off a whole load of other people? Probably in the British Dominion Empire, certainly the Mediterranean and North Africa is more important. Southern Europe is arguably more important, apart from perhaps the North Atlantic. So there's a whole load of things. But what I think the main point here is we're talking about strategy. And with strategy, we know that it's about decision making where everything or almost everything is uncertain. And therefore, there isn't a right or wrong approach. What is also interesting is we're talking about this from the position of we know what operations took place and what operations didn't take place. There are far more operations that are planned that didn't take place
Yeah, yeah.
than operations that did take place. And I think I mentioned this when we talked about Admiral McRaven a few weeks ago, in that, especially in the special operations world, because things are so high risk, we're quite often talking about things right up until the point where we decide they're not worth doing.
So let's talk about that. Does the military have a, I'm going to use the fancy word doctrine, probably the wrong word. Does the military have a framework for saying no? Now, I'm pretty sure there isn't a chapter of a document that says how and when to say no.
Well,
But I mean, I suspect it's sort of it's put into a decision making document. But do you know what I mean? As in, if I live in a world and I've lived in a business world where saying no to something is in a sense considered defeat. And actually, what I've noticed, there's a very emotional response to it. Very rarely, when you say no, do people say, that is a really interesting thing you're saying.
yeah,
I may or may not agree with it, but let's talk about this because no might be a valid answer. In the world we live in today, where we're very, the military, but the civilian world is like, our job is to solve problems and move forward. Saying no often generates a very emotional response, which is, oh, you're just being negative. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
So
absolutely.
how does the military recognize this, or is this one of those unwritten things? We've done a few of these where there's an unwritten rule.
So there are definitely bits of doctrine and bits of documentation that provide frameworks for decision making, and part of that is working out whether things are viable. Absolutely. And there are processes you go through where you literally get to what we call a decision brief. And it is always on the table to say, we're going to do this, we're going to do it, but we have to do these things first, or we're not going to do it at all. And then there are what we call go no go briefs, which is later in the process, but this is normally at a point where all the planning is done and we're now at the stage of we're going to execute the operation, but we need just a final check to make sure that everything we've said is within our risk tolerance is where we thought it was going to be. So actually for Normandy, for Overlord, there was a go no go criteria that led to the invasion being delayed, and that was the weather in the Atlantic in the English Channel. The invasion was planned for the 5th of June, and actually because of a storm in the English Channel, it was delayed 24 hours. It was very nearly delayed again, and it was very nearly called off completely because the weather, not the enemy, but the weather meant that the risk profile of the operation was such that it might not have been worth doing. Having said all of that, so, there are processes. There is also the human condition of saying no to things, especially when you put a lot of hard work into building up to doing a plan, is very difficult. And that is compounded perhaps more in the military than in other bits of organizations, but perhaps not, where saying no to a commander is difficult because they're your commander and there is an ethos of, we obey orders, we do what we're told. Discipline is a huge thing. And so actually being able to turn around to a very senior commander and say, no, sir, we can't do it, when they absolutely want to do it, is difficult. And then there is this other element of we do risky things, and therefore when people say they don't want to do risky things, that comes across as
Cowardly.
or just maybe cowardly is a little bit strong in most cases, but it could be
No, but actually,
but you don't have the right attitude.
I was about to say the danger is not cowardly, because cowardly is obvious, which says, well, I don't want to die, I'm not going there. It's the bit in the middle, which is, and I think this is the really difficult thing, which is when someone says no to you, should you listen to them or not listen to them? So the example you gave there was someone comes to you and says, boss, I don't think we can do it. I think this is a bad choice. I say we say no. Okay, do you say, right, you know more about this? I could say no. Do you say, well, I'm going to get someone who will say yes? Because there will be someone who will say yes.
Yeah.
That's the really challenging bit, which is what's the difference between an intransigent, negative, not an optimistic person, I'm just going to say no because it's easier for me to say no.
Yeah.
Versus someone who's saying no because steely-eyed, they know we are all going to die, and never mind us dying, but we will fail in our mission. And if we didn't all die, we could solve a different problem in a different way. In other words, less that this is a selfish no, it's actually a strategically important no. It says, if we attacked in Operation Jupiter and we sunk 25 destroyers and we sunk all our landing barges, you have wasted all these resources that we told you were going to be wasted when you could have used these resources attacking Italy, for example, as they did later. So that's the bit I really struggle with. And by the way, this is a podcast with human beings. In my career, there have been times when I have said the equivalent of no. And by the way, I very rarely say the word no because that's a difficult word. I will say things like, I don't think we can do this, or I don't think we should do this. There have been times when leaders have looked at me and said, let's talk about this. I think what you've got to say is important and I'm going to listen. And there have been other times when people say, well, you just, get me someone who's ready to say yes, because you don't understand the righteousness of our journey. And when we win, people will write books about how we overcame. I've got at home, I've got a row of books about people who overcame impossible odds and won. We're one of those. And so I do genuinely find that, in fact, even better, I find that a personal challenge when I say no. Is that because subconsciously I'm saying that feels too hard? Or am I saying it because actually this is not about whether I think it's too hard. This is because the mission is not going to succeed, and it will be a waste of our efforts.
And this is where I think, yeah, in the cold light of day, when we're talking about it over a glass of wine in a podcast, it's relatively easy to say this. The difficulty is actually knowing where this balance is, but it's the balance between recklessness and foolhardy determination against all of the objective common sense information that is being presented versus the fortune favors the brave,
Yeah.
he who dares wins, kind of being
That
bold quite often gives you an advantage. So finding that balance of, are we doing something that is deeply uncomfortable because we're talking about putting people in harm's way and taking risk, but actually this could unlock the problem. There is always risk, things could always go wrong, but actually we're going to be bold and we're going to do something unexpected, we're going to do something dangerous, but the reward is going to be big if it pays off, versus the, I'm just going to throw people at the meat grinder and hope that somehow it's going to work out. Hope is not a strategy.
And I want to give a real world example, because I read about this a few years ago, and my head nearly exploded when I read this. And that will be a very dramatic one, and it's very steely. SAS are involved. It's all great. But the point I really want to make is, I think you have these little mini conversations every day. So this is not about people in danger, big dramatic books written, films made. Actually, it is every day. Kitchener, I want you to go do a thing. Boss, I don't have the capacity to go do that thing.
Yes.
No, you don't understand how important it is. Anyway, I'm going to go. The story is fantastic, and then maybe we'll take a quick break. So I did not know this. So during the Falklands War, there was a lot of special forces activity, and actually quite a lot of it has now been written about. So, for example, once I met someone in the Royal Navy when I was in the Royal Navy, who said that during the Falklands, a very brand new helicopter was stripped. Some people in some uniforms were put into this helicopter, and the helicopter was never seen again. And it turns out, there's been a book written, I presume this is true, it was they were landing the SAS on mainland Argentina to position themselves around airfields to be able to watch things, in the helicopter crash, whatever. Anyway, that's fine. That actually very reasonable mission, hugely dangerous. In the end, it sort of failed, but it was a worthwhile thing. What I hadn't, so that was interesting to me. You know, I love a good daring do special forces, especially when there's Royal Navy involved. The one I then read about was, and I'm going to get all the details wrong, but this is me doing it on the fly with a glass of wine in my hand. There was a main airbase in Argentina where most of the raids on the task force were flying from.
Yeah.
So we've seen all these videos and films of the raids and ships being attacked and Sir Galahad and all this kind of stuff. And apparently the SAS proposed a plan where they would take 1 or 2 C-130 Hercules. They would effectively put most of the SAS into it. They would land their aircraft in the middle of the airfield. They would drive off on their Land Rovers, and they would look for and kill as many pilots as they can find and blow things up. Now, that is a film. Wouldn't that be an amazing film? The problem was, it was ridiculous, as in there was no plan to it. The plan was, we will land on the airfield and kill people. Oh, where are they? We have no idea. How many are they? We don't know. And it was a really good example. Now, my understanding is the SAS didn't put the kibosh on that. It was the Ministry of Defence who said, you are not bloody wasting the whole of the SAS on a mission which, from what we can tell, is designed to further the glory of the SAS and not frustrate. So that's a really, really interesting example where someone said no. But how many people have said, this is what we're here for? Who, you used the phrase, who dares wins.
Yeah.
This is about the most exciting thing you could imagine. And someone said no.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
It is. And as you were talking about those raids and those proposed raids, it reminded me straight away of the Iranian hostage crisis, and where the CIA, this is public knowledge, isn't it? The CIA and US forces famously got it very, very wrong. And of course, we're talking about, when you're talking about these kind of special forces activities, these are very high risk tactical operations where if it goes wrong, it's not just the loss of aircraft and loss of individuals, it's also the strategic consequences. And of course, the Iranian hostage crisis and the failed rescue attempt, it was the strategic ramifications of that rippled around and arguably still do have, yeah, negative effects for the CIA, have negative effects between Middle Eastern and US international relations. These are really, really serious things. With the Special Forces world, of course, it's the opposite of the conventional in that you very often don't hear about the really successful
Mm.
missions because they're highly classified. And it's only when they go wrong that they get exposed. But there are lots and lots of examples of missions that have gone really well when, on the face of it,
It shouldn't have
it
done.
shouldn't have done. And we
See,
can easily say,
see,
bold
I
activity.
know that's what's so difficult, which is, I think for many people, I bet if you came up with a list, if you had access to this information and you could have a list of missions that they either said they wouldn't do or they did, and of the missions that were then successful or not successful, I think you'd find it very difficult to predict and say. So
But I think there are things you can predict. And this is where breaking these things down into objective questions, and this is where the intelligence staff are brilliant at what they do, because this is literally how they do their work. They break these down into simplified problem sets, smaller questions, and then experts in particular fields. And that includes things like meteorological
yeah,
analysts. So it's not always top secret intelligence. It could just be, the Met guy comes in and says,
weather's not good.
there's a squall blowing up and
Mm.
there's a 50% chance that by tomorrow this could be a storm. And that might be enough for the commander to say, we're not going to take that risk. And I've been in go no go briefs where you have the intelligence officer there, you have the Met team there, you have the operations officer there, you have the legal advisor there, you have the political advisor there. You have all of these people, and you literally go along, and these are all discussions and things that have been analysed in lots and lots of detail beforehand, but you're at the point where you're about to launch the helicopters or launch the landing craft or whatever it is that the mission involves. And the commander says, intelligence, are we still green or red? Go or no go? And they say, looking at this, these are the updates since we last spoke, but I'm happy that this is all within the tolerances that we've discussed. It's go from me. Met. Yeah, actually, the weather's looking really good. We've had another update. The light levels are slightly lighter than we thought they would be, but this isn't going to have a huge impact. It's go from me. And it goes along, and then it gets to somebody, and they say, I've just received this new bit of information, and I think this just tips over, and so it's a no from me. And everybody looks at that individual, and it's really tense. It's awkward. You're about to launch people into harm's way, whether it's an exercise, whether it's
Yeah.
real life. It's tense. And even if it's an exercise, you're still launching people into harm's way because of the physical activities that we quite often do. And that person, everybody looks at them like, oh, but they've done the right thing. And in the face of, everybody wanting this to go ahead, everybody wanting to hope that this is going to be successful, they have objectively looked at something that has just tipped over that risk threshold that has been previously discussed to say, no, we have discussed risk. We've talked about what is acceptable and what isn't. And we are now, when faced with new information, in the space of this is not worth doing. And I think you talked about this being, analogous to commercial activities. I was talking to somebody the other day who was having a challenge with, they work in the marketing department of the organization, and they're having a real challenge with the sales department of the organization, which is strange to me because from not being from this world, marketing and sales don't seem that different, but apparently they are. And what sales were doing were overcommitting to what the business can provide to clients, and what marketing was trying to do was manage more holistically the reputation of the business, not oversell, not overpromise, and also all of the other things that marketing has to think about in terms of the legal aspects of what can be released and what can't be released. And then this particular business is a tech business, and it's in the cutting edge of AI enabled technology. And there's a lot of legal ramifications. There's also a lot of government interest in what they do. And they were effectively being shouted down as your naysayers. You don't get it. We're the people who make sales. We're the people who make money. This is a money-making business. You, you're standing in the way of progress. And I was having this discussion, and it feels very similar to what we're talking about.
This is why I was analogous. Let's take a quick break, but let's come back, because I think what you've touched on is a really interesting and potentially more pernicious variation. So we talked about missions where, to some degree, like the Operation Jupiter we talked about, you would say we have to do it, and someone could say, but actually there's other things that we could do that would be equally address those strategies. I think what you're starting to talk about now is, well, what if it's a slightly different situation where the raison d'etre of a business is to generate revenue? What happens when all of a sudden someone says, we can't do that for some reason, or we shouldn't do enough of that? So let's come back and talk about what happens there, because I think that's interesting. And I still think we've got an itch to scratch about how and when you say no. I think you've given examples of when people have said no and the process that leads to people saying no. This was genuinely, it's a challenge for me, which is like, when do you say no because no is the right answer? And when do you say, I just haven't thought of the right answer? I'll come back. So let's come back after the break. And I'm pretty sure we won't answer this, but let's give it our very best. In fact, pour another glass of wine. That is bound to help us, Gareth.
Wonderful. All right. See you after the break.
Welcome back. I can feel it's going to be one of those episodes where we leave it less satisfied than when we entered it. But we have topped up our wine glasses. We talked before the break about the challenges of knowing when it's time to say no versus when it's the time to say yes. And I think your examples and how the military thinks about it, break it down into small problems, get experts in the room, to some degree, be very thoughtful about sort of the yes, but the answer has to be yes. There have to be people in the room who are ready to say no. But you gave a really good example, and I'm almost ashamed it was you that gave the example rather than me, which was in business that you've come across, where I think the example you gave was the sales organization were effectively committing to more things than the business could deliver. And the marketing department was saying, okay, you need to stop now because we can't deliver on all of these things. And the reputational danger, the legal danger is so much. I can only imagine in the various organizations I've worked in, that is about as close to heresy as you can come up with, as in the raison d'etre of a business is to make profit. Now, I'm sure there'll be many people shouting at their podcast devices saying, no, it's to make customers happy and give them great experiences. I don't disagree with that at all. But the only reason why we have permission to go to work in the morning and receive our pay at the end of the week or at the end of the month is because the business has to make money. Likewise, businesses have to grow, and there are, whether it's existential, that if we don't earn enough money, we won't survive, through to it's not existential, but we have to answer to other people. That, I think, adds another layer of complexity, because in that case, and we'll come on to what else you can do. The statement, I'm going to make this overly simplistic. You should not sell things. You should not make money for the business. You should not hit the revenue targets that allow us to employ the people. That is an even more difficult situation. There's no other answer. We can't go and, say to people, go on, it'll be fine. You don't need to worry about the money. That's a reducing one where you don't have the option to say, we'll fight on another beach in a couple of years' time.
Yeah.
You don't have the option to say, that would have been an amazing raid on that airfield and we'd have gone down in history. You do not have that option. No, we have to sell things.
Yeah.
You don't understand.
So I think all of our military examples up until now have been go, no go, launching an operation. Of course, what we haven't talked about is what happens when things start to go wrong and you're already committed. And there are choices then about, do you commit the reserve? Do you add more to an operation that seems to be failing to see if you can unlock the problem? Or do you accept that reinforcing failure is not the right answer and that those extra resources you've got might be better placed elsewhere? And I think that analogy works slightly better because although we are still talking about people's lives, it's analogous to finance and money and
and there is the another sort of thing that makes it similar is there are a group of people who are already fighting.
Yes.
Do we cut and run? I mean, this is an extreme. Do we leave them to fail?
Yeah.
Do we leave them in captivity? The similar example in the business world is, do we allow the business to fail?
Yeah.
Do we say, or that part of the business?
That part of the business, and it might be, and of course, with all of these things, because we're talking about, it's back to my favourite subject of tactics versus strategy. The tactics is what is currently happening, what you are doing, and what you can do. The strategy is about outcomes over the long term under conditions of uncertainty. So when you're talking about committing reserves in a fight, and you're saying, actually, if we commit to this, we're just going to be putting more people into the meat grinder, more people are going to die, and actually the end result isn't going to change, or it's very unlikely. In a business context, that might be, we've committed, because we've got an overzealous marketing department, an overzealous sales department, and we've overcommitted. Do we honour that agreement at the detriment of our long-term business health, burning our staff out, using up resources, selling things at a loss, whatever the particular context is? Or do we take the short-term hit on our reputation, potentially lose a client, but stabilise the ship and think about the long term?
And even before we work out what the right answer is, I think one of the things to recognise is, you've already said it, we're sitting here, the glass of wine in our hands, in a nice warm room. The stress level is relatively low, I would say. All of a sudden, what you have just described is that you have set stress levels to 3x, to 10x.
Yeah.
In other words, to use your example of, we have a group of people in harm's way who are being shot at. We have the choice. We can either send more people that we have to get shot at. That's possible. We don't know whether they'll be successful. Or we can say, sorry, there's nothing we can do. There's no helicopters to take you out. You are on your own. Try and get out. At that point, in that situation, I can imagine the stress and the inclination is going to be, you don't understand. We cannot leave them for various excellent reasons. Professional, loyalty, mission reasons. And so the first thing to acknowledge, I think, is in a highly stressful situation, in a complex situation, there will be a very high proclivity to say, we're just not thinking about this in the right way. And that again, coming back to this, when's the right time to say this and when's the wrong time to say this? There's a time when you can say, we've thought about this in the wrong way. Oh my word, there's a unit that's transiting nearby with a very specific set of skills, or there's the Air Force that are, why don't we use them? We hadn't thought about that. And there's another case that says, there's nothing more we can do, guys.
Yeah.
We are now actually not serving the mission by burning cycles to keep trying to find a way to save these people. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
And I can imagine that people are like, we are not going to leave them behind.
So I think this comes back to a thing I said before the break, where I said hope is not a strategy. And if you are relying at a point where there is a decision to be made on we're going to find a new way of solving this problem, our current thinking, our current way of working doesn't solve the problem, so we need to think of something new, you are then relying on luck or an innovation that hasn't happened yet to get you out of a problem.
But again, this
It's
is
a really difficult spot then.
you are, because how do you know that if on the third try you wouldn't come up with something, or the sixth try, or the 10th try, as opposed to we're on try 999? Where's that line?
So I think I've said this before about innovation, where innovation is not beanbags and wood chip walls. Innovation is a thing that happens as a result of creative ideas, invention, the turning of ideas into practical tools, practical things you can do, and then the application of invention within the organization. So it's not something you can just create on the spur of the moment and say, we just need to be more innovative. And if that is literally your strategy, if that is what you're all thinking about, how you're going to apply tactics, do something differently to get you to where you need to be long term, then you've got yourself, perhaps absolutely not at fault, maybe it was just bad luck, but you've got yourself into a position where hope is now your strategy. I hope we can innovate our way out of this problem. And
Well,
Einstein, he's quoted as saying, doing the same thing over and over again, and
it's the definition of insanity.
Yeah, you end up in this situation where you're like, we're going to have to innovate our way out.
But
change.
It feels, when you're in that situation, it feels very rational.
Oh, I bet.
And I think there's an element of groupthink, which is, and that we haven't talked. We need to get a psychologist on, because I think there's an element here of psychology, which is people don't want to fail, people don't want to admit defeat,
no,
and people will reinforce other people who are saying, well, this idea of if we just try a bit harder, it'll work. Yeah. It is infectious, both in a good way, which is sometimes it is about, come on, lads, we can make this. It's a 20-mile march, but I think we can all make this. But again, you've got the flip side, which is people can march you to your doom because they say, we just need to think harder about this and we need to work harder. The psychology thing, I think, is really interesting.
So that's really interesting. When you talk about maybe getting people motivated so they can just dig in and work a bit harder, that's a very, very short-term thing. So as a local commander, and I'm bringing this back to the military because, this is the world I know so well, but, if you are in a tough situation and no one is coming for you, and actually the only option is you've got to do this on your own and get out of the problem, then motivating people to dig in a little bit, work a little bit harder, find the depth of physical endurance that they didn't know they had. And that, this is why the commando course and, arduous courses in the military are the way they are, is to give you the confidence to be able to do these things. Then you might be able to get yourself out of that challenging situation. You might be able to, do that. The helicopters have all gone down on the Atlantic conveyor. The mission's ruined.
Yeah, this is, by the way, for those people who don't know, this is the Falklands, where the British Army took down its helicopter airlift because the whole plan was they would fly the British Army across the Falklands as they attacked. And in the end, all of the helicopters bar one sank on the Atlantic conveyor.
Certainly all the Chinooks.
All the Chinooks. Yeah. And so in the end, the statement was, well, we'll walk then. And so this is famous pictures of Royal Marines yomping across the Falklands.
That is a really good example of where, in the face of things going wrong, you can apply a different approach and still have success. You can inspire confidence. You can motivate people to work a bit harder, to do something differently, and still have the successful result. That is a tactical command decision and it's short term. I think the challenge we were talking about in a business context is more of a this is the way we're operating, and if things don't change, we're going to run out of money or we're going to run out of people because we're burning them out. And this is where, at that higher level, you can't just always expect people to dig out and do a little bit more because people are human. You know, they can be the SAS, they can be commandos, they can be very well trained, very motivated, very fit people who have lots of endurance, but ultimately they're still people. They still have limits in stress, in fatigue, in physical endurance and capability, in motivation. And if you're strategically, not tactically, asking your people to dig in and do a little bit more, then you're now at the risk of running them hot. And if there's no end in sight, if this is not a we're now gonna walk instead of fly, but once we're there, we're still gonna achieve the objective. Well, now there's a goal. Now there's something we can achieve. If this is digging a little bit more because we've overpromised, then all you're doing is burning up people's overtime. You're burning up people's goodwill. You're putting pressure on their families. You're burning up all the stuff that is in the reserve tank for where an actual crisis comes. And now you're in a really precarious place. So I think there's a difference here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I've been in businesses where it's, again, I think this is where my challenge is. It's quite difficult to know sometimes, particularly in the fog of civilian war,
Yeah.
which one is a tactical approach that only lasts for so long, or which one ends up being a strategic approach.
If we go back to the business that I was talking to somebody about, that this AI tech business, where the sales team had overpromised and also were doing things that were risking the reputation of the company. If the decision maker, let's say it's the CEO, I don't know, it could be the chief operations officer, it could be the chief marketing officer, it doesn't matter. If the person who has the authority to make the decision says, I get it, we've overextended, everybody's going to have to work really hard to solve this problem. It's going to be a bit of a shitty month, but at the end of it, I'll take you all out for a steak dinner, and this will all go towards your end of year bonuses. It's going to be shitty, but we're going to get through it, and then we're going to learn the lesson so we don't do it again.
Yeah.
Then I think that's okay. You've got to recognize you're doing it. You're burning up your people's goodwill. Yeah, the overtime that they're doing, they're not, they're cancelling plans with their partners or families or whatever. That's not great, but it's short term. If at the end of that month, the sales team have done it again and they haven't learned anything and you haven't had those discussions and nothing's changed and you're back to, well, we've overpromised, so we've just got to dig in and make it work. Well, now you're in this strategic problem of you're always burning your people.
So there's a last thing that I think is interesting to talk about, which is, by the way, when you get into that cycle, that can be very difficult, as we've said, to sort of identify which one of those it is. Here's something that I've always thought of, which I've witnessed, and I witnessed this actually in the Navy as well as a junior person, but I've seen this sometimes in my civilian life as well, which is we allow ourselves sometimes to accept our constraints. So you say, we couldn't possibly do X. So in the example you gave is, well, we have a target and we have to meet that target. And so that is a very reasonable constraint. When you can't break out of that cycle, and that your example sounds to me like you're in sort of one of those cycles, I think then it's really important to go back to those overarching constraints. If the sales target is too high, you need to go back and say, we need to change the sales target. No, we can't do that though. No. Well, we'd have to lose 20 people. Okay. We either lose 20 people and make this sustainable, or we don't lose 20 people and none of us will have a job in X time or whatever.
Yeah.
So the rather than this being about sales targets, which is one of my parts of the world that I live in, actually, this is more about when you get to one of those problems where it feels like there's no immediate solution that we've talked about. In fact, what's been useful is we've used language about warning signs. Warning sign number one, you seem to think that there's an awful lot of we just need to try a little harder, or if only we came up with a quick idea, that would be great. Or it turns out that this hasn't been, we haven't just been running hot for a month or two. We've been running, there's warning signs there
Yeah.
that actually this is a pretty intractable problem. I think the next step is to take a step back and say, well, let's go one level higher and look at our constraints. Well, we can only have 20 people doing X. Well, what would we have to do to make it 30 people doing X? We have a different group that have applied this constraint. Well, we need to talk to that group and say, that is no longer a useful constraint anymore. And by the way, your goals are at risk. That I think sometimes can be very hard, either because it's a different part of the organization and you've all got to pull your weight and everyone's measured on this, or whether it's just we don't want to admit that we can't solve the problem. And I think this is why the psychology piece I think is so interesting. And we do need to find if any psychologists are listening, want to come and talk about this sort of pressonitis almost.
Yeah.
That would be, by the way, pressonitis is a proper word in aviation flying. And I have people I have known who have died because of this. This is a very well-known thing, just as it shows you how we're very bad at this kind of thing as human beings. When the weather comes down and you're flying a helicopter, for example, the rules of the game are, if you cannot see out of the helicopter, you should land the helicopter and stop. And by the way, being in a helicopter means you can kind of stop anywhere. So there's no excuse. But there's this thing called pressonitis where people say, well, it's not quite bad enough. It's just a little further to get home. It'll be fine. And then all of a sudden, as in the case when I was in the Navy, they hit wires and they crashed the aircraft and they died. And so one of the instructors actually died because they didn't recognize when it was time to stop. So we have this pressonitis about ourselves. But I love this idea of we can't change the tactical situation. So how do we change the strategic situation? Let's look at this differently. Let's reevaluate the constraints that we were working under. And you know how we keep saying we should try tactically to come up with an answer. Well, we should put just as much effort in the strategic constraints.
Yeah.
Well, they'll never say yes. Well, we need to go and tell them again. We need to tell them in a more compelling way.
So I think there's a couple of things here. Firstly, in terms of your pressonitis and where things are out of limits, if you haven't already listened to the interview with Paul Tremelling,
very good,
the Harrier pilot, there's a really good discussion about when you break the rules to get the mission done, and when you don't. And I think that discussion, Paul really brought out a really clear understanding of how you get that balance. The other thing you said was about metrics, was about having the feedback to know when the warning signs are starting to tick up. You've got those, warning signs. They might not be enough to say, stop, 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 we're in danger zone, but it's enough to say, perhaps we need a bit more information. Or if this continues, what are the consequences? And that's where I think the example I gave that's really clear of a go, no-go brief is really, really good, because it's something you do, it's something you plan in to say, we've discussed what we think we need to do, we've discussed where we think the risk is, we've looked at the risk reward, we've decided we're going to go for it and do this bold thing. But just before we do, let's do a confirmation, because things change, new information comes in, the situation might change such that the risk isn't worth taking anymore. And everybody within their own lane, whether you're the legal officer, the intelligence officer, the representative from the higher command, the political officer, they all have their own bit that they're responsible for, which means you don't get bogged down in the pressonitis. You you look at it from your perspective and say, I have been asked to take ownership of this particular aspect of risk. How much, and we've said this on the podcast before, risk is not a negative thing. Risk, the opposite of risk is opportunity, and it's all part of the same dial. So how much risk do I want to take for the potential reward that I'm going to get? What opportunity does this provide? And if you are very clear-eyed about that conversation, it should, if you've got the right feedback mechanisms, if you've got the right data, the right metrics, and you've got that psychological safety with which you can be honest and say, I don't think we should do this. I don't think we should carry on. Or I think this is a situation where the decision should be no go. Then you've chunked that problem down and people can look at it objectively or as objectively as possible from their perspective and provide advice to the decision maker. And I've been in situations where we've gone through a go, no go brief and somebody has said, sir, I don't think we should do this. It's a no go. And the commander has said,
I override.
Why? And they've said this, this, and this. And they've said, okay, I'm taking that on board.
Yeah.
But for these reasons, we're going to go. And that's their prerogative. They are the commander. That's the call they make. But they've made that decision, taking that on board, rather than are we all good? And everyone goes, yeah, we're good. Right, we're going to go. There has been a pause, a conversation, an explanation of why the advice is the way it is. Here is the new information. Right, we're going to assimilate that. We're going to make an assessment, and I'm going to make a decision. And sometimes that's why they get paid more money. Sometimes commanders have to do the hard thing.
Yeah, tape thing. It's really interesting. So we're coming to the end for the of this episode. Really interesting. We started with an operation in the Second World War that didn't happen. We have sort of talked about really this was an episode about decision making and some of the pitfalls of, rather than how do we make the decision to move us forward, sometimes it's how do we make the decision to not go forward, and why is that often quite hard, and how do you manage and work it out? And don't get me wrong, I still don't think I've found that place after only 53 years on this earth to be really confident that I'm always right with the yeses and the nos. I think it's interesting. I do want to make it really, this is something that's really important to me, which is we've used lots of very extreme examples, which arguably in the cold light of day, some would say, well, actually, that isn't a difficult example at all, Chris. I would make the same decision. The two things I want people to really think about is, number one, how do you make decisions when it's stressful? Because I think it's easy to make decisions when there's no stress. I think it's 10 times harder to make good decisions when you are under stress, or when there are high stakes at play, and therefore you are almost more inclined to ignore the risks and carry on.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, I don't want people to think this is only about big, important existential decisions. I think while it's much easier to talk in terms of these existential decisions, I think we've been talking about every single decision we make. Now, I'm not suggesting you spend hours pontificating over whether you should go to the shops and pick up that bottle of milk now or later, or whether you should put the shelf up or not. But actually, I do think this is true in day-to-day life. Should we do the upgrade? Yes or no? Yeah, but the customers need the upgrade. No, but we need to say no, because now is not the right time. But they'll be really angry with us, and we promised it. The answer is no for these reasons. So I don't want people to think this is only grand, highfalutin leaders with guns on their hips who are taking decisions and saying, I see no ships, sort of Nelson style. Actually, this is decision making at a grand level. But it's also the 20 decisions you make in a week where, when should you say no? So someone says to you, we need to do this thing and I need the slide deck by the end of the week. When do you say, I am not going to give you that slide deck at the end of the week?
Yeah.
I have that with my team. It's fantastic when they're like, literally, I was speaking to someone today and I said, this is something we need to do. And their answer to me was, I don't know whether we can do that. Okay. I could easily have gone down the, no, you don't understand. This is really important. Or I could say, okay, let's talk about why you've said no.
Yeah.
As it was, they told me and I said, okay, well, we don't have to do this. I'm willing to accept the risk on this, but we need to do that. So yeah, this, I know we make it sound like two drunk people with glasses of wine sometimes. Really interesting stuff. I hope that was, I don't think we sold anything for anyone, but maybe the value of this episode was to get people thinking about it a bit more and think how they participate. When was the last time you were in a room where you should have said no and you didn't? Or when someone said no to you and you looked at them, you pointed at them and said, you're just, you're always saying no. I need more of a can-do attitude. And was that the right or wrong thing?
Yeah, and I think as well, I would say, when was the last time you said yes in the back of your mind, hoping that
someone else would say no?
Well, or, and perhaps more importantly, you said yes, hoping that this situation won't arise again. So, the person I was talking to about this AI startup company routinely gets asked at the last minute to produce work for the next day and routinely says yes because they don't want to let the team down. But every time they say yes, in the back of their mind, they're saying, and I'm hoping this is the last time this happens because it ruins my evening.
Well, we're at the very end of the
podcast. It never does.
You were at the end of the podcast, and I think you said some magic words. I don't want to let the team down. I think that is some of the most dangerous and great words. People do amazing things because they don't want to let people down, and that has huge value. And people do catastrophic things where bad things happen because they made a bad decision because they didn't want to let the team down. Anyway, we should leave it. Well, maybe we'll come back and talk about it another time. Thank you very much for listening. I hope we haven't bored you with this. Hopefully it stimulated some interesting thought about decisions you've made, decisions you might have to make, situations you encounter. We are on X for those who want to get in touch with us. Tell us your stories of when you said yes or no and you shouldn't have done. Email us at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. If you have enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you subscribe. We would love to have us appear on your podcast feed every Thursday. We've been very good at that, haven't we? We do come out every Thursday.
Yeah.
We would also love if you would go back and look at some of the earlier episodes if you are a new joiner to us. Gareth talked about the Paul Tremelling episode. That really is a tremendous episode. Steely fighter pilots doing steely things in Afghanistan and teaching us valuable lessons about decision making. And frankly, we have episodes on pretty much every leadership or management topic you could imagine, whether it be ourselves or with guests. So please do like, subscribe, share, because frankly, it would be really dull if we thought we were recording this and no one was listening. We remember we did this episode, or we do this podcast, because our wives got fed up with us doing this down the pub. So like and subscribe. You're doing us a favor, because we're now doing this in front of a microphone rather than down the pub. Although I will leave you with this story about how dull myself and Gareth really are. We went out a couple of days. He's smiling because he thinks we shouldn't talk about this. We went out an unexpected evening in the pub. A number of drinks were consumed. I think we got to the point where it was tequila, although we did finish on port. I don't know where we went from tequila to port. So a number of drinks were consumed through the night. We were the last people in the pub, somewhere near 1 o'clock in the morning, with two other people in the pub, two young ladies. I can say this, by the way, because our wives know about this. And you'll be interested to know that we, in fact, struck up a conversation with these young ladies.
We did.
The sad thing is the conversation we had with the young ladies was about the future of AI. And when our respective wives got together and talked about this, I was told, Gareth, I don't know if you've heard about this, we have no game. And they are very, very pleased about that, as we are married men and they are pleased we have no game. So we'll leave you on that bombshell that myself and Gareth really are as boring as you would imagined, and that our wives believe we have absolutely no game. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you on the next episode of Battling with Business.
Thanks very much. Cheerio.